On the 10th of April, 1815, Indonesia experienced a massive volcanic eruption.
The eruption of Tambora was one of the largest in the last 1,000 years.
Around 100,000 people died in the eruption, more than ever before due to a volcano. But this was only the beginning. The eruption triggered global climate change. Rain and cold caused dramatic crop failures in the northern hemisphere, and famine stalked large parts of Europe. Anyone who could emigrate did so. Those who had to stay could only fight for survival or rebel.
After Tambora, there was crackdown by the authorities across Europe.
But they were all powerless against one enemy.
Terrible epidemics killed hundreds of thousands of people.
A new and deadly strain of cholera triggered by the freak weather conditions in the Indian subcontinent quickly spread around the world.
So, if you look at this particular suggestion,
it was an epidemic raging out of control.
How could a single volcano at the other end of the world cause so much death and suffering? Tambora's effect on the climate lasted for generations, shaping the Industrial Revolution and causing widespread political and social upheaval. Now, 200 years after its eruption, historians, geoscientists, climate researchers, and geneticists are working together for the first time to determine how Tambora changed the world. American environmental historian Gillen Darcy Wood from the University of Illinois is in London, tracking the global consequences of the Tambora eruption and how it shaped the 19th century world. London's Tate Gallery houses the largest collection of British artworks from that period, including works by the famous Romantic landscape painter John Constable. Constable's depictions of clouds make him an important chronicler of the global weather catastrophe following Tambora's eruption.
Constable sees himself as a kind of scientist of the skies, as a painterly meteorologist. The history of European landscape painting up until this time, the background, the horizon and the sky has been more or less decorative or ornamental with generic depictions of clouds. The way in which Constable's style converges with the story of Tambora is that owing to Tambora's eruption, the 18 teens are the cloudiest and wettest decade of the millennium.
But people in Europe still didn't suspect that their misery had been caused by a natural disaster on the other side of the world, on the Indonesian island of Sumbawa. 200 years on, the 2,850-meter-high volcano's flanks are covered by vegetation, and its crater rim gives little sign of the cataclysmic force of its eruption. Geologist Ralph Gertisse from Kiel University in the United Kingdom is surveying the area around the volcano. Born in Freiburg, he has been working on Tambora for years and is one of few experts to carry out field research there. He's trying to reconstruct the exact course and extent of the eruption.
I used this rangefinder to measure the height of the wall. The wall was formed by deposits left by the pyroclastic flow from the Tambora eruption in 1815. We've got about 9 meters of deposits here.
The vast amount of material comes from a mountain that was once over 4,000 meters high. The volcano had been dormant for centuries before its sudden reawakening in 1815. At the time, nobody had any inkling that Tambora would wipe out Sumbawa's population in a matter of days. 200 years later, archaeologists are searching for traces of the people who once lived here. Many archaeologists call it the Pompeii of the East because, like the ancient Roman city, the settlements around the volcano were suddenly buried by an avalanche of hot ash. So far, just 4 buildings have been unearthed, but archaeologists suspect that an entire village could be buried under their feet. It's a major project still in its infancy. Scientists at the Max Planck Institute for Meteorology in Hamburg are using computer simulations to investigate the fallout from the Tambora eruption and chart climatic changes around the world in its wake. They have worked out various scenarios, almost all of which show severe disruptions to global weather systems. They base their calculations on the location, time, and duration of the eruption, as well as the size and altitude of the clouds of sulfurous gases it releases into the atmosphere. In Tambora's case, at least 60 million tons of sulfur dioxide were blasted more than 20 kilometers up into the stratosphere, where high winds spread it around the globe. Average annual temperatures dropped sharply in many parts of the world. At the British Library in London, Darcy Wood is comparing the results of the climate researchers' simulations with contemporary records. There he discovers a source that sheds a completely new light on the consequences of the Tambora eruption from a region that researchers have largely overlooked so far, the Bay of Bengal in northeastern India. It's a medical book written by James Jameson, a doctor the British government sent to report on an increase of cholera outbreaks in the region. But Jameson started with about 80 pages of detailed weather records, the most meticulous description of the consequences of the Tambora eruption available to historians today. Jameson's records clearly showed that the normal alternation between the dry and monsoon periods in India was completely disrupted from 1816 onwards.
He had an interest in meteorology, an interest in medicine, interest in public health, and in this case in humanitarian disaster. And he saw himself as a writer who charged with capturing all of these things in one text.
May 1816. Winds from the sea usually bring heavy rains during the monsoon season, but not a drop had fallen this year, and the country was facing a severe drought. A fall in temperatures meant differences between sea and land were too small to draw humid air inland, and the fields were dry as a bone. The poor rural population was facing a severe crop failure. The turning point finally came 3 months later than usual, at the end of August, as the winds swept in the sorely needed rains. But they also brought catastrophe, even by Indian standards. Rivers burst their banks, sluicing away precious fertile soil. The weather turbulence continued for the next 2 years. Jameson's meticulous records made him the most important chronicler of the most profound distortions of the monsoon system since time immemorial. In Bengal, the chaotic weather laid the ground for a devastating outbreak of cholera, which would soon make history worldwide. Cholera bacteria have always naturally occurred in the ecosystem of the nutrient-rich brackish water. During the monsoon season, myriad rivers in the region flush large quantities of nutrients into the sea. Plankton carpets form on the surface of the water. But in 1816, the unprecedentedly long dry spells led to an explosion of plankton, and also of cholera bacteria. The high concentration and rapid spread of the pathogens infected more people than ever before. Within a few days, cholera causes a life-threatening loss of bodily fluids that often leads to death. Ralph Gertese is on his way back to Tambora. Helicopter is the only way to reach the inside of the deep crater at all. Sumbawa today looks like a tropical paradise of rainforests and coral reefs. But above it all, the brooding volcano. The volcanologist has already been up to the volcano's rim once. It took him several days to climb up it on foot, so he knows there's no way down into the gigantic crater. It's his long-cherished dream to stand on its floor. At last, the chopper touches down on the crater floor, where hardly anyone has ever set foot before. But he doesn't have a lot of time. The pilot can't risk switching off the engine. If it doesn't start again, they'll be stranded because there is no radio or phone coverage in the crater. Gertese walks to the foot of the crater wall to make his measurements. Here, we can see the elemental force still slumbering close to the surface.
If we go to the edge of the crater, we can see volcanic gases escaping, indicating that the volcano is still very active. The gases consist mainly of water vapor, but you can also see elemental sulfur forming around the gas vents, a magmatic gas originating from the still active magma reservoir inside the volcano.
Today, the volcano is barely 3,000 meters high, which means it lost around 1,200 meters, i.e. one-third of its height in the huge eruption. The unimaginable blast devastated the whole island and buried it under meters of ash. But it's completely unclear why such a gigantic eruption occurred at all, let alone whether it could happen again now. Because of its remote location, volcanologists have hardly been able to carry out any research into Tambora at all. Now, Gertese is using rock samples from the different layers to reconstruct the volcano's history. He can read the deposits like a book.
Samples from the 1815 deposits teach us a lot about the processes within the volcano before it erupted. For example, by analyzing these samples, we can determine how far below the surface the magma chamber was, and where the magma was, and how long it had been there before the eruption. We can also use an array of analytical methods to work out the magma's gas content and how much sulfurous gas was released during the eruption.
Den Gasgehalt der Magmen bestimmen und wie viel Schwefelgas zum Beispiel während der Eruption freigesetzt wurde.
The sulfur formed tiny droplets, so-called aerosols, in the stratosphere, and they reflected much of the sun's energy back into space and dispersed or absorbed the rest. That meant much less heat reached the Earth's surface and temperatures dropped. It took several years for the particles to sink back down to the ground. The Museum of Bread Culture in Ulm preserves the memory of these years in southern Germany to this day. The kingdom of Württemberg was particularly hard hit by the climatic turbulence.
We know today that 1816 had a very, very bad harvest due to freak weather conditions. This proverbial year without summer has gone down in history. Bad weather, lots of thunderstorms, and very little sunshine led to a disastrously poor harvest.
The spring had already been extremely cold and wet, so some farmers weren't able to sow their fields until the end of April. Some merchants had recognized the early signs of a bad harvest and were moving from village to village buying up the farmers' remaining stores of grain. The pious Swabians thought they were getting a good deal. But it was the merchants who really profited. As the price of grain soared in the next few months, many became very rich and hated.
Ganze ist 200 Jahre her, das heißt, da haben wir eine gute Dokumentenlage.
The whole thing was 200 years ago, so we have plenty of evidence.
Hier in der Ausstellung ein Stettnerscher
For example, the exhibition features one of Stettner's hollow medals
in Miniatur
with miniature pictures and text describing the famine.
Die eben diese Hungersnot beschreiben. Und man sieht vor allem fast auf jedem Bild.
Almost every picture features thunderstorms and incredibly dark skies.
Ein unglaublich dunkler Himmel. Also das hat
So this incomprehensibly strange weather, this climatic change, must have made a huge impression on people who had never experienced anything like it.
erlebt hat.
Summer 1816, near Lake Geneva. A young British couple, both aspiring writers, were visiting their old friend, Lord Byron. But their excursions into the countryside were thwarted by unusually cold weather. The couple had landed at the epicenter of a Europe-wide climate catastrophe. As the harvest in eastern Switzerland failed, starving farmers left the barren mountain regions and desperately wandered through the country in search of something to eat. Byron quickly got his friends away from the beggars and out of the raging storms.
This summer is foul. Almost constant rain keeps us tied to the house. One night we enjoyed a finer storm than I had ever before beheld.
These remarks came from 18-year-old Mary Goodwin, who was later to become famous under the name Mary Shelley. The young writer was already working on a Gothic novel that would mark the birth of modern horror literature. Frankenstein is the story of a scientist who creates a monster on a stormy night. But it was the poor who really suffered the true horror of these months. The situation in Switzerland, France, and southern Germany was deteriorating fast. As the famine spread, people stole out of desperation. Many hadn't had a regular meal for a long time and were completely emaciated. Malnutrition diminishes the body's defenses. Hundreds of thousands of people in Central Europe were affected.
Es waren über 50% der Haushalte, die wirklich
More than 50% of the households were really poor and really hungry.
sehr, sehr viel. Und es sind auch Menschen
That's a
gestorben,
huge number, and people were already starving to death.
gehungert sind. Es gab dann in der Folge der Hungersnot auch
The famine also caused terrible epidemics that killed hundreds of
daran
thousands
sind
of
natürlich
people.
auch Hunderttausende von Menschen gestorben.
Tambora's trail even takes us to Philadelphia.